Johnny Carson was a name that became synonymous with late-night television. For decades, he was the face of The Tonight Show, entertaining millions of viewers every night with his sharp wit and unmatched charisma. His smooth style, quick humor, and ability to bring out the best in his guests made him one of the most beloved TV hosts in history. But as much as everyone loved Johnny, there was a side to him that wasn't often seen by the public, a side that could show frustration and even dislike towards certain people. As the host of The Tonight Show, Carson had a unique ability to make people feel comfortable. His charm and natural ability to interact with everyone, from Hollywood legends to everyday stars, were unmatched. People saw him as the perfect gentleman on screen, always ready with a joke or a clever quip to keep the audience laughing. However, behind that polished exterior, there were moments when even the great Johnny Carson wasn't as calm as he appeared. Like anyone else, Carson had his limits. And that's what makes this story so shocking. Despite his typically easygoing personality, there was one guest who managed to push him beyond those limits. Imagine being on the set of The Tonight Show during the height of Carson's career. The show was a big deal. For any celebrity, being invited to sit on Carson's couch was a career milestone. It was the ultimate platform for promoting movies, albums, or whatever the latest project might have been. The best of the best came on his show: actors, musicians, and icons of all kinds. These stars knew how to work the room, deliver their lines, and keep things fun and lighthearted. But then there were those who didn't play by the usual rules. This particular guest was one of those who didn't quite fit the mold. They were someone whose reputation didn't match the polished image of the usual Tonight Show guests. Instead of playing along with the typical charm and grace of the show, this guest acted in ways that Carson, with his years of experience, couldn't ignore. Something about this individual made Carson uncomfortable, maybe even angry. The usually composed Carson wasn't used to dealing with people who tested his patience, but this guest did just that. What happened on that stage was unexpected, even shocking. The interaction between Johnny and this guest wasn't just an awkward moment, it became a lasting part of TV history. The audience had no idea what was really going on behind the scenes. To them, it might have just seemed like a tense moment or a bit of drama. But Carson wasn't just annoyed by this guest's behavior, it was something deeper. His frustration was clear to those who knew him well, but the public didn't get to see this side of Johnny often. For years the question lingered: why did Carson, who was so skilled at handling all kinds of celebrities, let this guest get under his skin? This story of Johnny Carson's most hated guest is more than just about a brief moment of tension. It's about understanding the complexity of the man behind the famous smile. Johnny Carson had a way of making everyone believe he was in control, always calm, always in charge, but like everyone else, he had his breaking point. And this guest pushed him to it in a way no one else ever did. What led to this moment? What made Carson, the man who could handle even the most difficult personalities, lose his cool? As the show continued to run, Johnny Carson's reputation grew, and so did his impact on the world of television. He was a master at keeping things light and funny, but behind the jokes, he was a man who had his own opinions, his own preferences, and his own limits. And when a guest crossed those limits, it was clear that even Carson couldn't always keep his cool. This situation with his most hated guest is a reminder that even the most professional entertainers are human, and sometimes, they have moments that the audience will never see. But here's the question that keeps people coming back to this story: who was the guest? Was it someone famous for causing trouble, or was it a celebrity known for being difficult behind the scenes? The truth about this guest is something few people know, and that's what makes it so fascinating. Who could possibly have gotten under Johnny Carson's skin so much that it became one of the most talked about moments in late-night history? This isn't just about a celebrity feud or a moment of awkwardness on television. It's about uncovering the real side of Johnny Carson, the person behind the curtain. We've all seen the perfectly put-together host on our screens, making jokes and interviewing stars, but what was Johnny like when the cameras weren't rolling? What did it take for him to let his guard down and show the world that even he could be pushed too far? This is a story that begs to be told, and it's one that keeps people curious even years after Carson's time on The Tonight Show came to an end. As we dive deeper into this tale, you'll learn more about Johnny Carson's true feelings, the unexpected guest who brought out a side of him no one expected, and the surprising impact it had on his career. So if you've ever wondered who could challenge the great Johnny Carson, stay tuned, because the answer might just surprise you. Johnny Carson, known for his calm demeanor and expert handling of even the most difficult guests, had one person who managed to push him past his limits. To those who knew him well, it wasn't just a random moment of tension, it was a situation that revealed something deeper about Carson's personality. It wasn't just about a little discomfort, it was something far more significant. For someone as experienced as Carson, who had spent decades on television dealing with all kinds of celebrities. It took a lot to make him truly frustrated. And yet this one guest did exactly that. As the host of The Tonight Show, Carson had seen it all. He had entertained the biggest stars, including Hollywood legends, musicians, and politicians. He had the ability to make everyone feel like a star, turning even the most awkward interviews into something memorable. But there was one guest who couldn't follow the script. This wasn't just a small mistake or an offhand comment, it was a guest whose actions completely disrupted the flow of the show. What made this situation so unusual wasn't just the guest's behavior, it was that Carson, the man known for his smoothness and control, couldn't hide his frustration. This guest, unlike many of Carson's other famous visitors, didn't come on the show to play along. They didn't fit the mold of the usual Tonight Show guest. Carson was used to guests who followed the unspoken rules of late-night television: keep things light, stay on topic, and entertain the audience. But this guest wasn't interested in playing by those rules. In fact, they seemed to actively go against everything Carson stood for during those interviews. This guest had a certain reputation, one that was known even before they appeared on Carson's show. They were no stranger to controversy, and in many ways their actions were the exact opposite of what Carson expected from a guest. What made the situation even more interesting was that Carson, despite his years of experience and his calm public persona, didn't know how to handle this guest. He had dealt with difficult personalities before, but there was something about this individual that made him visibly uncomfortable. Maybe it was the guest's attitude, or the way they didn't respect the format of the show. Whatever it was clear that Carson wasn't his usual self when this person was on the couch. For someone who had made a career out of staying cool under pressure, Carson's reaction to this guest was completely unexpected. The tension between Carson and the guest became apparent during the interview. To viewers it might have seemed like a minor moment, just another awkward pause, or a quick exchange that didn't quite go as planned. But for those watching closely, it was clear that there was something more going on. Carson, who could normally keep things light, was noticeably irritated. It wasn't just the usual TV banter or a little playful back and forth, there was genuine discomfort in the air. Carson wasn't known for showing his frustration on camera, but this time it was hard to ignore. His attempts to steer the conversation in a more comfortable direction seemed to fall flat, and the guest, either unaware or indifferent, didn't help the situation. The real mystery behind this moment lies in the fact that Carson rarely showed this side of himself. Over the years he had built a reputation as a master interviewer, someone who could talk to anyone and make them feel at ease. He had made a career out of turning awkward situations into gold, so why was this guest so different? What was it about this particular individual that made Carson, the consummate professional, lose his usual composure? It wasn't just that Carson had to deal with a difficult guest, it was that this situation revealed something deeper about him. Carson had always been someone who could navigate even the most challenging interviews. But this guest made him feel something that was rare for Carson: frustration. And it wasn't just about the guest's behavior in that moment, it was about the bigger picture. What was it that made Carson so uncomfortable with this guest? Was it the guest's disrespect for the show's format? Was it the guest's attitude, or was it something more personal? As the interview progressed, Carson tried to keep the show moving smoothly. He did his best to hide his irritation, but to anyone paying close attention, it was clear that he wasn't happy. This wasn't just a small moment of tension, it was a bigger sign that even Johnny Carson had limits. This guest had pushed him to the edge in a way that no one else had before. And while the audience may not have fully understood the extent of what was happening, Carson's crew behind the scenes knew that something was off. This moment wasn't just an isolated incident, it marked a significant shift in how Carson viewed certain types of guests. Before this, Carson had been known for his ability to make any interview work, no matter how difficult or challenging the guest was. But this guest changed that. Carson's reaction to this individual was different than anything he had shown before, and it's this moment of tension that continues to intrigue fans and TV historians alike. Who was this guest, and what was it about them that pushed Carson past his breaking point? That's the real question that keeps people curious. Was it a guest with a history of difficult behavior, or was it someone who simply didn't understand the rules of the game? What was it about this individual that caused Carson, the legendary late-night host, to lose his usual charm and composure? The curiosity surrounding this guest only deepens as we look at Johnny Carson's career as a whole. He had hosted The Tonight Show for years, handling countless celebrities, each with their own unique personalities. But despite all that experience, he couldn't quite manage this one guest. What was it about this individual that left Carson so visibly irritated? The answer lies in the story itself, one that has been kept somewhat of a secret for years. But now, as we dig deeper, the truth is finally coming to light. When this controversial guest walked onto the set of The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson, the host known for his calm and controlled demeanor, probably never imagined just how much trouble he was about to face. Carson had spent years making even the most difficult celebrities feel comfortable on his couch, but this guest was different. This wasn't just another famous face appearing for a lighthearted chat about their latest project. No, this was someone with a reputation, someone whose presence brought with it a wave of tension. This guest was no stranger to controversy, and their reputation wasn't built on a foundation of kindness or charm. In fact, it was the complete opposite. Before they even stepped onto the stage, this guest was already known for their behavior off-screen, an individual whose actions had stirred up public outrage time and again. Their reputation for causing trouble was well known. Whether it was a scandal, a fight with another celebrity, or just generally making headlines for all the wrong reasons, this guest was always in the media for something negative. It's safe to say that they were far from the typical polished guest that Carson usually welcomed on his show. Carson, the man who had built a career on handling all types of personalities, was about to meet someone who would test him in ways he'd never been tested before. The question on everyone's mind now is what made this guest so difficult to deal with. Was it their attitude? Or was there something else that set them apart from the usual stars Carson had interviewed? What was it about this particular person that made them different from the countless other guests who had sat on the same stage before? When this individual appeared on The Tonight Show, it quickly became clear that they didn't come to play by the rules. This wasn't someone who respected the unspoken agreement between host and guest. Typically, when stars appeared on Carson's show, they knew what was expected of them. There was a kind of unspoken contract between Carson and his guests: come on the show, be charming, stay on topic, and give the audience a good time. But this guest didn't follow those rules. They walked into the interview with an air of defiance, and it didn't take long for Carson to realize that this was going to be no ordinary interview. What made this even more interesting was that Carson wasn't just dealing with a regular celebrity. This guest had a strong personality, one that was impossible to ignore. They had a way of making everyone around them uncomfortable even if they didn't intend to. Their actions on and off the set were always the subject of rumors, and their very presence on The Tonight Show was enough to raise eyebrows. This wasn't a celebrity who was going to go along with the flow of the conversation. This was someone who would likely challenge Carson in ways he wasn't used to. Now, the real mystery becomes, what exactly did this guest do to push Carson so far? Why was it that someone with such an established reputation as a host, someone who had faced every possible situation, couldn't handle this individual? Was it just that they didn't fit into the world Carson had created on his show? Or was there something about their presence, their energy, that disrupted the normal flow of the show? These questions linger in the minds of everyone who has heard the story but never fully understood what made this moment so unforgettable. As the interview continued, Carson's discomfort grew. For the first time, viewers could see a crack in the persona that he had worked so hard to build. Carson had always been in control of his interviews, able to handle anything that came his way. But with this guest, his usual tricks didn't work. No matter how many jokes he tried, no matter how much he tried to steer the conversation in a lighter direction, the tension only grew. The guest didn't play along, and it was clear that they weren't interested in making the interview enjoyable for anyone, least of all Carson. But what made this guest's behavior so unsettling was more than just their actions on the show. It was their complete disregard for the kind of atmosphere Carson had worked so hard to create over the years. Johnny Carson had created a space where stars could come and shine, where they could promote their work and still entertain the audience with a sense of ease. This guest didn't want to be part of that system. They had their own agenda, and they weren't interested in following the rules of the game. This was a celebrity who didn't care about playing nice, and that was something Carson, who had spent so many years working with big names, simply couldn't ignore. The curiosity surrounding this guest grows because on the surface it seems like just another awkward celebrity moment on late-night TV. But if you dig deeper, you realize that this wasn't just about a bad interview. This was a moment that revealed something about Carson himself, something that people didn't expect. He had always been the professional, the one who could handle any situation, but this guest pushed him to the edge. It wasn't just a clash of personalities, it was a clash of worlds. So who was this guest? Why did they act the way they did on The Tonight Show? What was it about them that made Johnny Carson, the king of late-night TV, lose his usual cool? The more you think about it, the more curious you become. What was this guest's story, and how did they manage to turn a seemingly ordinary interview into something far more memorable? The answers lie in the moments that followed this tense encounter, but even now, years later, the mystery of who this guest was and what they did continues to captivate those who have heard the story. As the interview progressed, things started to take an even more unexpected turn. Johnny Carson, who had spent his entire career handling difficult guests with grace and humor, was now visibly struggling to keep control of the situation. His usual quick wit, the thing that made him so famous, wasn't enough to manage this guest. What started as a standard interview was quickly becoming something much more uncomfortable for both Carson and the audience. The tension in the room was thick and you could feel it through the TV screen. It wasn't just awkward, it was a moment where Carson's cool, collected image began to crack. Carson was always known for his ability to turn uncomfortable situations into something entertaining, making even the most challenging interviews seem lighthearted and fun. But this guest wasn't allowing him to do that. No matter how many jokes Carson tried, no matter how hard he worked to steer the conversation into safer territory, it seemed like this guest wasn't interested in playing along. The audience could tell there was something off about this interview, but they weren't exactly sure what it was. Johnny Carson, the man who made it look so easy for years, was now facing a guest who seemed to throw him off balance in ways he hadn't experienced before. The guest didn't just ignore the usual flow of conversation, they actively resisted it. Johnny had always been able to keep the show light and fun no matter the subject. He could talk about anything with anyone and make it interesting, but this guest wasn't giving him that chance. It became obvious that this wasn't just a personality clash, it was something deeper. There was a sense that the guest wasn't just there to promote their work, they were there for something else entirely, something that made them a difficult presence for Carson. What was it about this guest that made them so different from all the others? They weren't just an ordinary celebrity coming on the show to promote their movie or new project. This guest wasn't playing the game by the rules Carson had spent years perfecting. The curiosity behind the scene grew as viewers tried to understand why this guest had such a disruptive effect on the interview. What had caused Carson to lose his usual calm? What made this guest so hard to manage? It was more than just a clash of personalities, it was a complete breakdown of what made The Tonight Show work. Carson had mastered the art of interviews, his charm and quick wit were legendary. But with this guest, nothing seemed to work. The usual tricks, the usual flow just weren't cutting it. This wasn't just a moment of awkward silence, this was a complete breakdown in the normal exchange between host and guest. And it wasn't something Carson could easily brush off. The more Carson tried to steer the conversation back to familiar ground, the more the guest pushed back. The questions that would have been playful in other circumstances now felt forced. The usual friendly banter that filled the air with laughter was gone, replaced with a noticeable tension. Carson's usually smooth responses were now marked by short pauses, and it became clear to the audience that he wasn't enjoying this as much as he usually did. The more Carson tried to make the interview work, the more it seemed like he was fighting a losing battle. As the tension grew, Carson's discomfort became harder to hide. His sharp wit wasn't enough to mask his frustration with this guest. This was a moment where the difference between a professional and an amateur interviewer became clear. Carson, who had handled countless stars, could no longer keep the conversation flowing as effortlessly as he once had. And it wasn't because he wasn't trying, in fact he was working harder than ever to make it seem like everything was fine. But despite all his efforts, it was clear this interview was going nowhere. What made this guest so different from the others Carson had interviewed over the years? Was it their behavior, or was it the way they completely disregarded the rules of the late-night interview game? Carson had been on television for decades and had hosted some of the biggest names in the world, yet this one guest seemed to have a power over him that no one else had ever managed to do. Why was Carson, the man who could handle anyone, so visibly thrown off by this guest? As the night wore on, it became clear that the audience had picked up on the tension too. The usual atmosphere of easy laughter and playful conversation was missing. In its place was a sense of awkwardness that even the most talented comedian couldn't lighten up. This guest had not only disrupted the interview, but they had also managed to shift the entire energy of the show. Johnny Carson, who had spent years being the master of interviews, was now struggling to keep his composure. The cool, collected host who had once made difficult situations look easy was now fighting to salvage a conversation that was slipping out of his control. So, why did this particular guest have such a profound impact on Johnny Carson? What was it about them that caused a legendary host like Carson to lose his usual grace and poise? The curiosity around this question continues to grow as more people learn about the infamous moment. The answer lies in the way this guest pushed Carson's limits in ways that no one had done before. It wasn't just about one awkward interview, it was a moment that revealed a side of Carson that very few people ever got to see. Who was this guest? What made them so different from all the other celebrities who had graced the Tonight Show stage? What was it that caused Johnny Carson, the master of interviews, to struggle in such an unexpected way? As the story unfolds, the answers to these questions become more and more fascinating. This wasn't just about a guest being difficult, it was about understanding Johnny Carson himself and what made him at his core the person behind the legendary TV host. And when it comes to discovering the truth behind the tension of that night, one thing is clear: it wasn't just about a bad interview, it was about a moment that defined Carson's true limits. As the interview continued to unfold, it became clear that things were spiraling out of control. Johnny Carson, the seasoned late-night host who had spent years making even the toughest interviews seem easy, was no longer in control of the situation. Despite his best efforts to steer the conversation in a more comfortable direction, this guest simply refused to cooperate. Carson, known for his smoothness and quick wit, was struggling to keep the show moving. The usual charm that made him a beloved TV host wasn't enough to diffuse the tension in the room. What was happening in that moment? How had a simple interview turned into such a dramatic situation? Carson had been through all sorts of challenges on his show over the years. From major celebrities to controversial figures, he had seen it all. But this guest wasn't like the others. This wasn't a moment of simple awkwardness. No, this was a breakdown in the very dynamics that made Carson such a master of his craft. Carson had never been one to let his emotions show, but it was clear that this guest was pushing him to his limit. Why was this guest different from all the others? Was it their attitude? Was it the way they behaved on the show? Was it something about their presence that disrupted the entire atmosphere? This question lingered in the air as viewers and those behind the scenes alike were left wondering what had made this moment so intense. The situation wasn't just uncomfortable for Carson, it was uncomfortable for everyone involved, including the audience who could feel the awkwardness through the television screen. At this point, the audience was fully aware that something unusual was happening. They had seen Carson in all sorts of situations, but never like this. The typical easygoing atmosphere of The Tonight Show was replaced by something much more tense. What was it that caused such a shift? Was it just the guest's behavior, or was there something deeper at play? The more Carson tried to recover from the tension, the worse it seemed to get. No matter how many jokes he cracked or how he tried to steer the conversation to something more lighthearted, the guest's energy continued to disrupt the flow. Carson was known for his ability to adapt to any situation, but this guest seemed to be immune to his charm. The usual tricks that had worked with so many other celebrities weren't having the same effect. It wasn't just the guest's refusal to follow the usual format that made this interview so difficult. There was something in the way they held themselves, something in their energy that made the entire situation feel wrong. It wasn't just an offhanded comment or a moment of awkward silence. It was a complete shift in the dynamic of the show. Carson had spent his entire career creating a specific energy on The Tonight Show, a mix of humor, ease, and charm. This guest, for whatever reason, wasn't playing by those rules. Instead of contributing to the conversation, they seemed to be actively working against it. The guest's behavior wasn't just uncomfortable, it was unpredictable. They didn't seem to care about the usual rules of engagement for late-night talk shows. Most guests came on the show with a clear goal to promote their latest work and entertain the audience, but this guest had their own agenda. It wasn't just about promoting anything, it was about making a statement, one that threw the entire flow of the show off track. Carson's usual professionalism was being tested in ways that few other guests had ever done. And it wasn't just a matter of Carson's discomfort, it was about something more fundamental, his ability to keep control over a situation. What was it about this guest that made them so unpredictable? Why did they throw Carson off balance in a way that no other celebrity had? The curiosity about this encounter only deepened as people tried to understand why this interview was so different from any other. Why couldn't Johnny Carson, the man who had made a career out of handling difficult personalities, find a way to turn this situation around? The tension was building, and it was becoming clear that Carson was struggling to regain the easy rhythm that he was so well known for. What was the cause of the disruption? Was it the guest's attitude or something deeper? The questions started to pile up as viewers and fans began speculating about what had caused Carson's frustration. How could someone who had interviewed thousands of celebrities, handled difficult moments, and kept the show running smoothly for years be so visibly uncomfortable with one guest? As the night wore on, it became apparent that Carson's usual calm demeanor wasn't enough to salvage the situation. The frustration was written all over his face, and the audience could feel it. There was no hiding the tension, no smooth way to make things light again. It wasn't just the guest's behavior, it was the way the entire interview had been derailed. Carson, who was usually the master of managing these situations, was being outpaced by this guest's unpredictable energy. It wasn't just about the interview anymore, the true mystery of the situation was why this guest had such an effect on Carson. What was it about them that caused the legendary host to struggle in such a way? The more you think about it, the more curious you become. This wasn't just about one difficult guest, it was about an entire shift in the dynamics of the show. Johnny Carson's reaction to this guest wasn't something that could easily be explained away. It wasn't just an awkward moment, it was a significant disruption to everything Carson had built over the years. What made this guest so different from all the others? Why did they manage to frustrate Carson to the point where he couldn't control the situation? Was it just their behavior, or was it something deeper? The curiosity behind this event grows as the story unfolds, and the answers to these questions continue to captivate anyone who has heard about this strange moment on The Tonight Show. As the interview came to a close, there was a sense of unresolved tension in the air. Johnny Carson, the man who had always been able to handle the most difficult guests with ease, found himself in a situation that even he couldn't control. The entire night had been a series of awkward moments where Carson's usual charm and quick wit weren't enough to manage the situation. For the first time, it seemed like the legendary host was out of his depth. What was it about this guest that made them so difficult to deal with? Why couldn't Carson turn the interview around, as he had done countless times before? The more people thought about it, the more curious they became. This wasn't just a simple case of a bad interview. This was something much bigger. The guest had disrupted not just the flow of the show, but the entire atmosphere that Carson had spent years cultivating. The smooth, easygoing feel of The Tonight Show was gone. In its place was a sense of discomfort and uncertainty that had never been felt before. It wasn't just awkward, it was palpable. The tension in the room was so thick that you could almost cut it with a knife. As Carson tried to wrap up the interview, it was clear that both he and the guest were ready for it to be over. But the damage had already been done. The moment had already shifted the mood of the entire show. Carson, who had spent years building his reputation as the master of interviews, was now faced with a moment that would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. The audience had been left with a sense of confusion, wondering what had just happened. Why had such a simple interview turned into such a chaotic and uncomfortable experience? The curiosity about this moment only deepened as people began to talk about it. Was it just a clash of personalities, or was there something more to it? Why had Johnny Carson, a man who had handled hundreds of guests over the years, been so visibly thrown off by this one? What was it about this particular guest that had made them so difficult to manage? These questions lingered in the minds of those who had watched the interview, and even those who had only heard about it afterward. It wasn't just about one awkward interview. This moment represented a breakdown in everything that Carson had worked so hard to build. He had created an atmosphere on The Tonight Show that was smooth, light, and entertaining. It was a place where celebrities could come, relax, and connect with the audience. But this guest had completely disrupted that dynamic. They didn't play by the rules, and they didn't care about maintaining the easygoing tone that Carson had established for so many years. In fact, it felt like they were actively working against it. At this point, the question on everyone's mind was, who was this guest? Why did they have such a profound effect on Carson? Was it just the guest's behavior, or was there something else at play? What was it about them that made Carson lose his usual cool? The more people thought about it, the more intrigued they became. This wasn't just about one bad moment, it was about a complete shift in the dynamics of The Tonight Show, and a rare glimpse into a side of Johnny Carson that few had ever seen before. As time passed, the story of this interview began to grow. It wasn't just a funny or awkward moment, it had become a symbol of how even the most experienced host could be thrown off balance by certain guests. It had become a reminder that not all interviews could be saved, no matter how hard the host tried. This wasn't just about the guests' behavior. It was about the way they had completely changed the atmosphere of the show. Carson had spent years creating a space where the audience felt comfortable and the guests felt at ease. This one guest had managed to shatter that illusion in a matter of minutes. In the end, the true mystery of this interview wasn't just about what happened during the segment. It was about the lasting impact it had on Carson and the show. Johnny Carson, the man who had made a career out of handling the most difficult personalities with ease, had been left struggling. This wasn't just about a bad interview, it was about a moment that pushed Carson's limits and left everyone questioning what had just happened. The more you think about it, the more curious you become. Why did this guest have such an effect on Johnny Carson? What was it about them that caused such a dramatic shift in the tone of the show? And perhaps most importantly, what did this moment reveal about Carson himself? Was it simply an uncomfortable encounter with a difficult guest, or was it something deeper? As the years passed and the story of this infamous interview became a part of television history, the answers to these questions remained elusive, keeping people hooked and curious for more. Even today, people still talk about that interview. Some remember it as a moment of unforgettable tension, while others view it as a glimpse into the challenges that even the most seasoned hosts face. The truth about what happened that night may never be fully understood, but one thing is certain: it was a moment that changed the way people viewed Johnny Carson, and it was a moment that would live on in the history of The Tonight Show forever. The mystery surrounding that interview continues to fascinate people, leaving them with a sense of curiosity that lingers long after the show ended.